I was standing in my own kitchen, still in my work clothes, when my mother-in-law walked in, set her oversized handbag on my granite countertop, and said it as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. "I paid off your mortgage," Carol announced, folding her hands with that particular smile she reserved for moments she considered victories. "So naturally, my daughter will be moving in. I hope you've already started clearing out the guest room." I remember the sound of my coffee mug hitting the counter, not breaking, just landing with a dull ceramic thud, the kind of sound that doesn't match the magnitude of what you've just heard. Mark stood in the doorway behind her, his eyes fixed on the floor tiles, and in that single moment of his deliberate, studied silence, I understood something I hadn't been willing to admit for a long time. He had known. He had known for weeks, possibly months, and he had chosen his mother's plan over the most basic act of loyalty a husband owes a wife. The simple, irreducible act of telling her the truth about her own home. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how we got here, because the story of that evening didn't begin with Carol's announcement, and its full weight can only be felt if you understand what came before. Mark and I had bought our house 3 years earlier, a modest 2-bedroom in a neighborhood we both loved. Old trees lining the sidewalks, a bakery 2 blocks down that smelled of cardamom and brown butter on weekend mornings, neighbors who waved from their porches. I had fallen in love the moment our realtor unlocked the front door and the afternoon light spilled across the hardwood floors in long amber rectangles. Mark squeezed my hand and said, "This is it." And I believed him completely. The way you believe someone before you learn to read the spaces between their words. The mortgage was more than we were comfortable with, honestly. I was a project manager at a mid-sized marketing firm. Mark worked logistics at a distribution company. Together, we made it work, but just barely. Every month, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and our bank statements, mapping expenses like a general planning a campaign, the heating bill, the car payments, the groceries, the small fund I was quietly building toward the renovation of the upstairs bathroom that still had its original 1980s pink tile. Not glamorous, but ours. Genuinely ours. Every creak of the old floorboards, every draft from the windows in February, every Saturday morning pulling weeds from between the hostas in the back garden. I had grown up in rented apartments, always in spaces belonging to someone else, and the feeling of owning a place, of being the person who decides what color the walls are, was something I never quite stopped being grateful for. I held on to that feeling the way you hold a railing in rough water. I didn't know then that someone had been quietly loosening the bolts. Mark's mother, Carol, had been a presence in our lives from the start. A woman who never receded into the background, no matter how much the situation called for it. 63, recently retired from a career in property management, and she carried that history like a credential, deploying it with the authority of someone who has spent decades deciding what belongs to whom. She dressed precisely, pressed slacks, neat blouses, silver hair set in a style that spoke of daily discipline. She moved through rooms as though assessing them, touching things lightly as she passed, the edge of a shelf, a picture frame, my kitchen countertop. And her eyes did the quiet, careful work of appraisers. I had noticed it from our very first meeting. I had chosen to interpret it as confidence. That was my first mistake. In those early years, Carol's intrusions were low-level enough to manage, the kind of thing you absorb without naming. She would stop by unannounced and rearrange the throw pillows to better catch the light. She would comment on my cooking with the exquisite precision of someone who wants to be heard as helpful. That's an interesting approach. She would ask about our finances in questions that sat exactly on the edge of polite. Are you managing the payments all right? Property taxes really do sneak up on you. And I would answer in brief, pleasant sentences designed to close the subject. Mark would observe from across the room with the expression of a man who has decided that whatever he doesn't acknowledge cannot require him to act. I had learned to recognize that expression. I kept deciding to read it as tiredness, distraction, the general overwhelm of a man trying to keep his wife and his mother simultaneously satisfied. The house was what anchored me. When Carol's visits ended and the front door finally clicked shut, I would stand in the hallway and let the quiet settle back around me. The tick of the radiator, the distant wind chimes from the neighbor's porch, the faint smell of lemon polish on the banister. I would look at the amber light on the hardwood and feel myself return to something solid. This was mine. Whatever happened outside these walls, this was the place I had chosen and earned. I held on to that feeling harder than I realized. I didn't know it was the last thing standing between me and the truth. The first time something felt genuinely wrong was a Tuesday in February, about 8 months before Carol's announcement. I had come home from a difficult meeting, the kind where every decision you've made gets examined by people who weren't there when the problem was created. And I was tired in that bone-deep way that has nothing to do with sleep. I made tea. I changed out of my work clothes. I settled onto the couch with the deliberateness of someone who has earned an hour of doing absolutely nothing. Mark was on the phone in the kitchen. His voice came through the wall in a low, careful register, the tone he used when he was choosing each word before releasing it. I wasn't eavesdropping. The walls were old and thin, and I had long ago stopped pretending otherwise. But I heard enough. I know, Mom. I know. I haven't said anything to her yet. A pause. Because it's not the right time. Another silence. Longer. I'll figure it out. Just give me a little more time. I sat with my tea and stared at the middle distance and ran through every innocent explanation I could construct, building each one up carefully and watching it fail under its own weight. Mark came out 5 minutes later, saw me on the couch, and produced a smile just a fraction too easy. "Long day?" he said. "Dinner in 30?" I said yes to both, and I didn't ask about the call. In the weeks that followed, Carol's visits multiplied. Where she had come once every few weeks, she was now appearing every few days. A casserole, a magazine, a question about the attic insulation. She moved through the house with her usual light appraisal, but there was a new quality to her attention, something more purposeful, like a person who has shifted from browsing to purchasing. She lingered in the guest room longer than any pretext warranted. She opened the linen closet and stood studying its contents. Once I came around the corner and found her in the doorway of our main bedroom, the door half open, looking in with an expression of quiet calculation. When she heard my footsteps, she drew the door closed with the unhurried ease of someone who has decided they've done nothing requiring explanation. "I was just admiring the light in there," she said, turning to me with her warm, measured smile. "You've made it so lovely, Sarah." I thanked her. I put the kettle on. I did not say what I was thinking. Mark had started coming home late. Not dramatically, just enough to arrive after dinner was already packed away. He would kiss the top of my head, sight traffic or a project running over, and we would exist in the same space without quite inhabiting it together. There were evenings I caught him staring at his phone with an expression I could not name. Not guilty, exactly, but contained. the expression of someone managing something that requires constant, quiet effort to keep from showing. I asked him once, directly on a Saturday morning in March, while he was making eggs and the sun was doing its best through the window above the sink. He kept his back to me a moment longer than the question required. "Is everything all right?" I said. "Everything's fine. Why?" "You seem like something's on your mind." "Just work stuff." He turned and offered the smile, warm around the edges, practiced in the walk from stove to counter. "Nothing that needs worrying about." I sat down. I nodded. I told myself I believed him. What I should have done was push. Ask the second question. Ask the third. But I had spent years in that marriage becoming skilled at the art of not making things harder than necessary, of smoothing every friction, of giving benefit of the doubt until the doubt had no edges left to catch on. I called it maturity. I called it trust. I was simply afraid of what the second question would uncover, afraid of the answer that would require me to act. The discovery came on a Thursday evening in October, 6 weeks before Carol's announcement. Mark had gone to a work dinner, and I was home alone cleaning, because that was what I did when I needed to restore order to something uncertain. I wiped the counters, swept the kitchen floor, and moved to the small room off the hallway that served as Mark's home office. I was not looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I was dusting, moving the familiar objects on his desk, the coffee mug full of pens, the framed photo of us at the coast the summer before last, the stack of papers held with a binder clip. The stack shifted. A single sheet slid free and fell face up to the floor. I picked it up. I read the letterhead. And then I read the first paragraph. And then I read it again, because the first reading had not penetrated. The way very large things sometimes don't penetrate immediately, the way the mind requires a second pass to accept what the eyes have already seen. It was a letter from our mortgage lender. Not a routine statement, but a formal letter of confirmation, dated 6 weeks prior, acknowledging receipt of a lump sum payment, clearing the full remaining balance of our home loan. The mortgage, the letter stated in the flat certainty of official language, had been paid in full. My hands were steady as I turned the page over, looking for context, for explanation, searching for the version of this that made sense, and then I found the attachment, a single page, paper clipped to the back, and the steadiness left my hands entirely and did not return. It was a notarized statement of gift documenting the source of the payoff funds. Donor, Carol Margaret Hines. Amount, the full remaining mortgage balance. Date, 8 weeks prior. And at the bottom, in the space marked, Acknowledgement of conditions attached to gift, 2 signatures, Carol's, in her neat, controlled cursive, and Mark's. Conditions attached to gift. The phrase cycled through my mind on a loop that wouldn't resolve, turning over and over like something caught in current. What conditions? What had he agreed to, in my home, without a word to me? When had this happened? This negotiation, this transaction, this moment where our house became a gift with strings. And I had not been present, had not been consulted, had not even been told? I sat down on the floor, not gradually, not gracefully. My legs simply stopped cooperating. The paper was still in my hands. The desk lamp hummed. Somewhere outside, a car moved slowly past and its headlights swept briefly across the window and were gone. My heartbeat was in my throat and my ears and behind my eyes, and the silence in that room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I read the documents 3 more times, slow and careful, hoping repetition would change their contents. It did not. When I finally stood up, my face was dry. I had expected tears. The size of the moment seemed to call for them, but what came instead was something quieter and far more dangerous. It was the cold, clear sensation of a door swinging shut on everything I had assumed to be true. I set the papers back exactly as I had found them. I walked to the kitchen. I stood at the sink and looked out at the back garden in the October dark, at the hostas I had planted in spring, the fence I had painted white 2 summers ago, the small square of land I had believed was mine. And I began, very quietly, to think. Mark came home at 10:30 that night, smelling of restaurant food and the particular forced ease of a man who has prepared himself for an ambush that may or may not be waiting. I was at the kitchen table with a glass of water I hadn't touched, the documents from his office sitting in front of me in a neat stack. He stopped in the doorway. He noticed. I watched his face move through several expressions in the span of 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, and then a settling into something carefully neutral that was, in its own way, the most damning thing I had seen yet. A person who is innocent does not become neutral when they see the thing they're being confronted with. A person who is innocent becomes alarmed. "Sit down," I said. He sat. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The lamp above the table cast its yellow circle and made everything outside it feel far away. I slid the notarized statement of gift across the table toward him and watched his eyes drop to it and then back to me. "How long?" I said. He pressed his mouth flat. "Let me explain." "How long, Mark?" He looked at the table. 3 months. She came to me in July. She had the money from the Lakeview property sale, and she said she just wanted to help us, that we'd have more breathing room. I thought, what did you think specifically when you agreed to attach conditions to a gift involving our home without telling me? The silence that followed was the longest of our marriage. Then, she said it would be better if you didn't know until it was done, that you'd overthink it, that you'd find a reason to say no. I let that sit between us. She said it would be better if I didn't know. Sarah, and you agreed with her. He didn't answer. What are the conditions, Mark? All of them. He looked at the papers, at the lamp, at everything except me. Jen needs a place to stay, he finally said. The job in Denver didn't work out, and she's been at Mom's, but Mom has the 1 bedroom, so just temporarily, 3, maybe 4 months. Show me the full document, I said. He hesitated for 1 second too long. That second told me everything. He went to his office and came back with 3 stapled pages I had not found, the complete agreement. I read to page 2 before the cold thing in my chest became something enormous and very still. Attached to Carol's gift was not simply a temporary arrangement for Jen. The conditions included Jen having use of the guest room for a period no less than 6 months, renewable annually. Carol herself would have unrestricted right to visit without advance notice. And on page 3, in a clause I read twice before my brain accepted it, in recognition of the donor's financial contribution, the parties agree to consult the donor on any future decisions regarding the sale or significant modification of the property. Consult the donor on any future decisions regarding the sale. She made herself a stakeholder in our home, I said. You signed something that gives your mother a say in whether we can sell our own house. It's not legally binding, he said. It's just, Mark. I looked at him very steadily. Do not finish that sentence. He didn't. I left the table, went upstairs, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. and I thought with the methodical, cold precision of someone who has finally run out of the energy required to hope that things will be fine, about exactly what I was going to do next. The following morning was when Carol arrived and made her announcement. The handbag on the counter, the folded hands, the smile like a flag planted in conquered territory. Mark stood in the doorway, eyes on the floor. She had brought pastries from my bakery down the street, set in a white box with a ribbon, placed on my counter with a cheerfulness that made my teeth ache. "I know this is a little sudden," she said in the tone she used when performing reasonableness, "but really, when you think about it, it makes complete sense. We're family. And frankly, with the mortgage cleared, you're in a much better position than you were a year ago. I would think a little gratitude wouldn't be out of place." I poured myself a coffee. I did not pour one for her. I leaned against the counter and looked at her across the kitchen. "What clause on page 3 of that document do you think is enforceable, Carol?" The silence that followed had the texture of a person who has been caught faster than expected and is now recalibrating. Carol's expression didn't change, precisely, but something shifted in her eyes. A quick, small adjustment, the way a calculation adjusts when a new variable enters the equation. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "The clause requiring us to consult you on future decisions regarding the sale of the property," I said. "I'm curious whether you actually believe that's enforceable, or whether you drafted it knowing it wasn't and hoped we wouldn't notice." Carol unfolded and refolded her hands, gathering patience. "Sarah, I understand this is a lot to take in. I really do. But you need to understand that I wasn't trying to create conflict. I was trying to help." Her voice shifted slightly, acquiring the tremor she kept in reserve for maximum effect. "I paid off your mortgage. Do you understand what that cost me personally? I did that for you, for both of you, and now you're standing there making me feel like a criminal." "I'm not making you feel anything," I said. "I'm asking you a legal question. I don't need to be interrogated in my son's home. This is not your son's home." The words came out quiet and level, and I watched them land. "My name is on the deed. My money has been in this mortgage for 3 years. The fact that you paid off the balance does not make you a resident or a stakeholder or entitle your daughter to my guest room." I set down my coffee cup. "What it means is that you made a financial gift, which I will treat as a gift, or, if you prefer, as a loan, in which case I will have the full amount repaid within a timeline my attorney considers reasonable. But the conditions you attached are not valid because I did not sign them, and in this state, one spouse cannot unilaterally encumber shared marital property without the other's consent, which I believe you already knew." Carol looked at me. Then she looked at Mark. And in the look she gave Mark, not angry, not hurt, just assessing, recalibrating, looking for the next available angle, I understood something about them that I had been carefully not understanding for 4 years. She wasn't a mother who loved her son too much. She was a woman who had treated her son as an instrument for as long as he'd been available to be used, and what I had mistaken for his weakness was, at least in part, his training. He had been taught, for decades before I arrived, to facilitate her plans and absorb the consequences. I felt a brief, complicated grief for the version of Mark that had existed before I knew him. Then I set it aside. "Mark," I said, without looking away from Carol, "I need you to ask your mother to leave." He pushed himself off the doorframe. He opened his mouth. He said, "Mom, maybe we should—" And Carol looked at him and said, "Sit down, Marcus." And he sat down. That was the moment it was truly over. Not the marriage, not yet, but the version of my life in which I was still hoping Mark would choose me. I had my answer. I called my father from the driveway that afternoon, sitting in my car with the engine off. He was 68 and retired, and he answered on the second ring, the way he always did. "Tell me," he said. I told him. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "What do you need?" "A recommendation for a family law attorney, a good one." He gave me a name within the hour. Patricia Ellsworth had the quiet authority of someone who doesn't need to announce itself. She reviewed the documents across her desk and looked at me with the expression of someone who has seen this particular mechanism before. He signed an acknowledgement of conditions. She said, "Not a contract. There's a meaningful legal distinction. You didn't sign anything. The consultation clause is unenforceable. What you actually have is a gift that one spouse accepted with conditions attached, without the other spouse's knowledge or consent." She set the papers down. "That's a problem for your husband, not for you." Patricia's letter to Carol was 2 precise pages. It acknowledged the gift. It declined the conditions. It noted that any attempt to enforce the consultation clause would be contested, that the unrestricted visit provision had no legal standing without the homeowner's consent, and that any unauthorized occupant of the property would constitute trespass. Carol called Mark within an hour of receiving it. I was in my kitchen when his phone began to ring, and I watched him look at the screen and then look at me with an expression I had never seen from him before. Worn to the bone, finally, with something that might have been the beginning of clarity. He let it go to voicemail. It was not enough, but it was something. The confrontation that the wider family heard about happened the following Saturday at a dinner Carol had organized and decided to proceed with anyway. Because Carol was not a woman who yielded to first moves. She had invited Mark's aunt, 2 cousins, a long-standing family friend, an audience carefully assembled. I walked in with my father. The look on Carol's face lasted half a second before her performer's reflexes reassembled the warmth. She gave her speech. The sacrifice, the family she had only wanted to support, the ingratitude she had encountered, the daughter who simply needed a temporary home. She was poised and articulate, and her voice wavered at precisely the right moments. She was very good. When she finished, I said, "Would anyone like to see the agreement?" I had brought copies. I passed them around the table. I watched the aunt's expression change. I watched one of the cousins set the papers down and look at Carol. Carol looked at the copies in people's hands, and her smile went slightly rigid at the edges. "I simply wanted to make sure my investment was protected," she said. "Surely that's not unreasonable." My father had not spoken until that moment. He looked at Carol from across the table with the patient, level gaze of a man who has nothing to prove. "You attached conditions to a gift given to your son and his wife, without the wife's knowledge," he said. "You arranged for one party to sign an agreement about property that belongs to 2 people. I'd like you to think carefully about whether you want to pursue this further, because the only thing that happens next is that it gets more expensive and more public." He paused. "I don't think that's what you want." The dinner ended shortly after. Carol's friend left first, quietly. The cousins followed. The aunt embraced me on her way out, brief, firm, wordless. And that embrace said more than anything else that evening. Jen never moved in. The months that followed were not simple. Mark and I spent weeks in a kind of negotiated limbo, circling the question of whether what had happened was something that could be rebuilt or something that had simply revealed what had always been there. We went to a couples counselor whose main observation was that Mark had a long-standing pattern of prioritizing his mother's preferences over his own life, and that addressing it would require more commitment than he might currently be capable of. Mark did not argue. He sat with it quietly, turning it over. Some days it felt like the beginning of repair. Some days it felt like two people standing in the ruins of something, each holding a piece, not yet sure whether the pieces belonged to the same structure. Carol sent one more letter in November through her own attorney, a brief attempt to reinstate the consultation clause on different grounds. Patricia responded. The matter ended there. It is spring now as I write this, 7 months later. The hostas are coming back in the back garden. The same ones I planted 3 years ago, reliable as ever, making their return from wherever things go in winter. The bathroom renovation is scheduled for June. The old pink tile will be gone by July, replaced with something I chose entirely on my own terms. The lemon polish smell is still in the hallway on Sunday mornings. The amber light still falls across the hardwood floors in the afternoon, the same as the day I first walked in and decided this was home. I used to think the opposite of conflict was peace. I understand now that sometimes the opposite of conflict is simply a longer and more expensive form of loss. Standing at my kitchen window in the early light, hands around a coffee mug, watching the hostas push through the dark soil while the scent of cardamom and brown butter drifts up from the bakery 2 blocks down. This is what I kept. Not untouched, not unchanged, but mine. Still, irreversibly, stubbornly mine.